Okay, so next we have Jasper, who will be talking about flipped learning.
Okay, right. Well, I'm going to follow on from Sean in the same School of Health and Social Care, but quite a bit of what I'm talking about is going to sort of flip out of the school, really, and it's going to be more around teaching and learning. I'm Principal Lecturer and School Director of Teaching and Learning, and I've been experimenting with flipping the classroom for the last 5 years. But you'll quickly see it's just one take on the flipped classroom. I'm sure there's many different variations of it. I've been doing it for the last 5 years, and like Sean, I'm experimenting with use of film in teaching, and in comparing notes in terms of virtual reality and creation of short films to introduce students for topics in teaching. What I find is that I would normally keep my film content to 6 minutes, and Sean would normally keep his film content to 2 minutes with virtual reality. And I think one difference possibly between the two forms of content for use in teaching is that immersive reality, you might need to think carefully about how you do it. So I would say Sean in the middle there's got a laboratory set up for a prototype. And I've just had a quick chat with Kirsty as well to say that really we could probably really benefit from working with psychology and to understand how to do this, such experimental things in our teaching, and to ensure a good learning environment is maintained. I've been working as a student engagement champion, so I'm interested in what Tommy was saying about, okay, well, what's in it for the student? How does flipped learning help the student experience? Towards the end, I'm going to do a bit of a summary of success in the flipped classroom from student experience, students that have really excelled with some of these digital approaches that I've adopted. I've also been working with JISC for the last couple of years as a student expert on a number of their panels and co-design teams as well. So I suppose I'm regularly working with many other higher education and further educational institutions to understand what this might look like in another concept. And I'm working with Sheffield Hallam at the moment on a student digital project as well. So what I'm really interested in, more than flipped learning, the flipped classroom, is blended learning. It's really the blend of online and face-to-face modes of teaching and learning experiences. That's really what I'm most interested in. And there is a big gap in the research knowledge about the student blended learning experience. So I have included in this presentation a few examples, or notes from the flipped classroom, if you like. What I'm interested in as a student engagement champion is getting more balanced staff, student, teacher, learner partnerships for learning. Not just in the teaching classroom, but also across disciplines. I work and train the student engagement, student consultants, and we're just about tomorrow to train 12 more student consultants. So hopefully somebody in the room is going to pick up on that, because in my experience, sometimes we can learn a lot more about the student blended learning experience by talking to students beyond our discipline or beyond our university even. In terms of the pedagogy, I'm really rooted in terms of social constructivist and participatory pedagogies. And that really helps me think about the kind of digital tools I'm going to use. I'm going to concentrate quite a bit on Google Forms in this presentation, and one or two other tools. And the intention, the pedagogy behind the flipped classroom for me is really creating the kind of online and in-class learning environments and experiences which make students more confident, that increase self-efficacy. So one tool I use quite a bit, a visual tool, is Wordle. And quite often I would get information from students from Google Forms, collate it, and then put it into the classroom on a word cloud like this. This word cloud was one I used at the JISC conference a couple of years ago when I presented with students around the student digital experience within the discipline and outside the discipline. And the feedback that students gave then in terms of blended learning experience was that the online environment needed to be very, very accessible. that they needed information in a range of different ways, and they particularly benefited from opportunities to consolidate the learning. So I have incorporated those features in most of the blended learning designs I've used since then. And in terms of accessibility, I've worked with a lot of other organisations to think about layering website designs in such a way that the learner, whether it's a student or a member of staff, could access the information and then be further informed by going further on the website. So the teaching challenge I want to focus on next is really increasing diversity in the classroom. And Sean touched upon this. We talked about some of our students in health and social care who aren't typically necessarily 18 years old. We have groups of international students. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But we also have distance learners, parent students, mature students, ethnic minority groups, and so on. What I've discovered through diagnostic assessment with new student groups is that, of course, the digital confidence and readiness ranges tremendously across student groups. And many students, of course, are digitally confident and able, but some are not. So scaffolding the learning, scaffolding the digital experience is something that I've incorporated in quite a few of my designs. I've also used digital tools to adjust delivery a midpoint as well on or during a single teaching activity, so that I can bring on board different kinds of learners. So in terms of a basic structure for blended learning design, it's very much for me 3 phases, and I think you'll see this in a lot of the literature: before class, in class, and beyond class. It also reflects a lot of the feedback we get through training student consultants in terms of what they look for in great teaching as well. But the warning indicator is that before class you do have to work a lot harder. You have to prepare a lot more materials than following a more traditional route. For the case studies I'm going to talk to you about, I've focused on new learners, understanding more about new learners, getting a good learning profile for them, using the get-set data to do that, getting them all to do a preparatory online task before the first teaching session, and that including for international students. And then in class, experimenting with quite a wide range of teaching methods and styles, and then gathering student feedback. And that helps me to develop a learner group profile that is much more extensive than that which I might get from just talking to other staff and looking at the other data. Beyond the classroom is much more active in a flipped classroom. The lectures are much shorter, usually only about 20 minutes. There's lots of group work and discussion and other features like that. And then after class, I would carry on the journey with students. And I've done this with students in my discipline, and I've done it through training with student consultants as well, and other international groups of students, where I've organised filmed exit interviews, which are then used for new group cohorts of students coming through. And this has proved to be particularly useful for international students. So here's an example of some exit interviews using a talking head approach, sometimes one-to-one, a single student talking about their experience, sometimes a group of students, or sometimes a larger group of students, all focusing on one different aspect. So just a bit of a case study then in terms of a new cohort group in the health and social care programme, which is getting bigger. Not the size of the nursing cohort that Sean talked about, but 64 students. So bigger and more diversity. We have 15 certificate entry students within this cohort, an increase from the previous year. And before the class, I got the students to do an online task, and I gave them an outline of what we were going to be doing in the teaching session. All the materials are up quite early on Blackboard site. And then during class, I got them to do this diagnostic assessment using a Google form to do that, which you can get them students to complete individually online, but then you can collate the results in class and work with the whole group of students or small groups of students in class with the results. An important feature about doing some of the online activities with students in the classroom is that you can see them and you can observe the digital skills across the cohort. You're much closer then to seeing the students that might be struggling, and you can also respond to individual queries that come up. So in terms of starting students on the right foot digitally, it's quite a useful technique. And to my knowledge, not many universities are doing that yet. A lot of people talk about formative and summative assessment, but the diagnostic assessment for blended learning is really a key opportunity, I would suggest. And another factor that rises is that when I flip the classroom, I don't usually do so well with the quieter learners, and I've had to work quite hard to develop the digital tools and the approaches to make it an enjoyable experience across a diverse learner group. One of the ways to do this is not to focus too much on group work activities, students having to talk up in class, but to use some digital forms, digital tools, and other pen and pencil activities so that students can make individual contributions. And of course, using a Google form, students' contributions can be kept anonymous, which does lead to much higher participation rates by students. So another feature is I've talked about giving a really short presentation with students and then following it up with an opportunity to apply the concepts that I've introduced in the presentation in a different way. On this occasion, I've just shown you a couple of large AO-style posters which I developed from an earlier professional conference with staff from social work practice, which I then brought into the teaching session so the students can have the opportunity to work with real case scenarios. And they can also take part in an activity and add their own contributions. They're all given a task for each poster. And what I do is that I do it as I've done, and I'm sure many of you have done at conferences, rather than talking to a large group of people, break it down into a roundtable activity. So you might spend 10 or 15 or 20 minutes with 10 people, and then they would move on to the next presenter or next task. Doing that with students, what I do is I get students to contribute their responses to each poster activity and look at the other student contributions. They can choose to either do that socially, if they want to do that, and discuss in their smaller groups, or they can quietly add their individual comments. But all the comments get picked up in that way. They have just 6 minutes on each activity, and then at the end I get them to go around and review some of the best contributions. And I'm sure you're familiar with that kind of approach at conferences, but it's quite a dynamic approach to adopt in the classroom as well. As a dovetail technique, what I also would do is I would introduce an activity to gather more data about the student digital experience as well. On this occasion, I use a learning style, which I'm going to briefly show you. So I find the Google form very intuitive, and it does allow you to frame the activity with the students if you're doing it for developmental purposes, more so than Poll Everywhere, where you might get a scattering of really interesting feedback, but without the structure. With a Google form, you can structure it, and the forms, the ways in which you gather the information can be very varied according to how you want to do it. So the dovetail technique I used here was to find out more about the student individual learning styles in the group. And I had some information up about different learning styles. I got the students to name the learning style which they related to. For some students, of course, that wasn't one, that was two. And then I got the students to do an online activity as well on using a Google form. 46 students responded within a minute, and then I clicked collate to bring up the results, and it brings you a nice pie chart, which you can do for multiple choice style questions. So as you can see, visually it's quite easy to see what some of these entrances are. We had 21% of students that were visual learners. We also had a high proportion of physical learners, to my surprise. I don't know whether that was because I'd introduced quite a physical element of moving around the room with a poster activity, whether that connected with that. But that was certainly something I definitely didn't expect to see. We had other students who were visual and solitary learners and preferred learning on their own, and had other students who were visual and social learners. And so it yielded quite a bit of information about the learning styles. And the program leader was team teaching this session with me and discovered all sorts of things about the students that they weren't previously aware of. So it was quite an interesting exercise. Also asked them which teaching method they enjoyed. And the majority enjoyed moving around the posters and adding comments. Some liked working with a larger group or working with others, and some people preferred doing things on their own. 3 or 4 of them were very logical learners. They enjoyed the process and reflecting on the overview of it. So after the session, what I do with this kind of session is I would recruit some students from that teaching session to act as reviewers for the group. And what that does is it gives you some really rich data about the student experience in the first term of undergraduate studies. So obviously it's not representative of the group as a whole. It's very, very small numbers. We're only talking about 3 or 4 students at a time. But it does give some valuable insight if you want to connect with the student blended learning experience. So I'm just checking whether I've jumped over something. Okay, so then really, just to summarize then, in terms of a flip teacher perspective, what I wanted to know was what made a student successful in the flipped classroom, what really worked. So what I did last year was I tracked students who got the best outcomes in the module that I was delivering and asked them what techniques they'd adopted. And what came back was that they'd all engaged before class with the learning materials. They'd all had a very clear plan as how they're going to work through all the activities and all the materials and to use them in the assessment event. And they paced their learning. So quite a few students said that coming to each of the teaching sessions was a key feature of that. Perhaps not a surprise to anybody, that one. But finally, it was really important to have opportunities to clarify the expectations, and that's something that I've worked on a lot more in the last year in terms of Blackboard design that makes the teacher intentions very clear. And in the School of Health and Social Care at the moment, we're thinking about making the contract between teachers and learners much more explicit as well, not just across one programme, but across the school, in terms of thinking about what we can communicate with students at different levels of study and teach assessment activities that can make the student journey more comfortable and more effective. So what does it mean for you if you're teaching the flipped classroom? Well, I think it's about preparing much earlier, considering perhaps a wider range of formats. Secondly, really helpful if you can layer the online materials and give really clear instructions for learning objects in terms of what you're wanting students to do prior to joining the flipped classroom. A lot of our colleagues and other higher education institutions and Higher Education Academy and JISC are all working on this and reviewing their online presence. And a lot of those agencies are needing to improve their online learning design at the moment. As more and more formats are being created and technology is rushing forwards. Another tip would be to work with student reviewers to adjust and improve delivery. And this is where impartial student perspectives can add quite a bit to what your student experience might tell you. So that's worth considering. And finally, the area of co-production of the curriculum. It might be smaller adjustments in terms of curriculum delivery, but it might involve other areas, new areas of curriculum design and content as well. And that's it.